In our last class, we spoke about structuralism, the School of Structuralism, founded by Edward Titchener. We also spoke about William James, the founder of the Functionalist School of Psychology. We began with psychoanalysis. We discussed some aspects of this school, but I think it wouldn't hurt to talk about them again in the form of a review. The founder of the psychoanalytical school is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is definitely one of the most influential psychologists, famous or infamous, whichever way we'd like to see it. His legacy to psychology has survived, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in this screencast, and will continue to survive, despite any controversy, opposition, practical decline, puritanism, whatever you want to call it. As mentioned in class, Sigmund Freud was a physician, and the reason why I bring this up again, I'm not sure in what section you are, because I did mention this and I highlighted it in one section, I believe, is because we cannot forget that psychology is a science that was born from or originated from philosophy on one side and biology from another. So it is important to always remember how the main contributors to the field have either been related to biology or physiology and or philosophy. Sigmund Freud, his premise about humanity is that we're not good. We are born bad. And a little bit more specifically, that we are irrational and motivated only by drives instinctually or driven by reflexes in a way. Freud is huge on this concept, on the unconscious, as we said. And the unconscious is basically the part of our mind that we are not aware of. And as mentioned in class, there are two components to the unconscious: memories and drives. And drives, there are only two of them, and it is sex and aggression. And what are drives? Basically, what motivates all our behavior. In the end, what really makes us to do anything we do. And again, Freud says that our only motivations, our only drives, our only instincts are related to sex and aggression. Now remember that as a physician, Freud, his patients were what he considered mentally ill. In fact, he would call them, he would say that they had neuroses. And this could be either from, odd behavior, biting fingernails, high levels of anxiety that were not allowing these people to function properly or at work or at home, and had perhaps intrusive thoughts. And it's important to always remember that, because it relates to, we have to consider that context and to his conclusions, right? And his approach to studying behavior and mental processes. And his methods, basically, as we are not aware, his methodology, as we are not aware of the unconscious, his methodology aimed at opening the doors, right, or gaining access to the unconscious. Remember, we cannot do this on our own, right? We cannot just say, oh, I'm going to really focus and think about any repressed memories or think about my drives, my frustrated drives in the past, and we cannot do this. So this could only be done, his methodology, which we're going to explain, and as I mentioned in class, could only be done with a skilled psychotherapist. A skilled psychoanalyst. Again, let me repeat, the only person or the only way to gain access to your unconscious, to revisit these repressed memories, to revisit these frustrated drives, the only way is through the professional help of a skilled psychoanalyst. So his methodology mainly are two, dream interpretations and free association. Dream interpretations, as its titles say, you'll see in psychology, one good thing is that, despite all the memorization and reading, many of the titles are exactly as they as their label mentions. So dream interpretations is exactly like that. It's the interpretation of dreams. The patient would lie in a couch. Therapist would speak very little in a psychoanalytical session, and basically the therapist would help you or the patient interpret what these dreams meant. Because according to Freud, Sigmund Freud, the unconscious will manifest itself. You see, the unconscious will not stay by, okay, well, I'm just happy here with my repressed memories and my repressed drives. No, it will show in the form of mental illness and in the form in your dreams and your thoughts, and basically he would help you break it down to what this represented, what that action represented, etc. Free association is also mentioned in class. It's basically another technique that Freud used in which the patient would feel freely to talk about anything that came to mind. Of course, right? This is important. To free associate, something that I encouraged you to do this weekend, but you have to say it. Like, I want to free associate with my friend or whoever you meet over the weekend, or your family. Or I doubt that you guys will do that. With your family, I wouldn't do it. I would feel a little self-conscious. But anyway, the patient needed to feel full trust and comfort necessarily, right, to speak freely. Hence, without any taboos, any judgment, any fear, etc. Again, because it was immediately what came to mind. The last main aspect of Freud's contributions is, and we're going to go more into this when we reach the personality unit, is that Freud developed a model of the mind, right, or psyche as he called it. And according to psychoanalytical theory, right, founded by Freud, because I think it was he himself who came up with this theory, pretty sure, is that our mind consists of three parts. These are the superego, the ego, and the id. So our mind is built with these three main elements. So let's try to explain these. These are quite interesting, as a matter of fact. So we are born with the id, right? And the id, as Freud well said or explained, we're born bad, right? We're born with a reservoir, I'd say, of drives and desires. So the id is seeking pleasure, is only seeking, according to Freud, sex and aggression. Now, we're only born with these two goals, wishes or powerful motivators that direct our behavior at all times, right? And they're gonna, and these in the id is the child or the, I'd say even the teenager in us, very pleasure seeking and self-centered, right? You might, of course, disagree. And then the id is that very spoiled, demanding that all of us have. That spoiled and demanding, I think about a 2 or 3 year old, right? That throws a tantrum. Why? Because he or she doesn't get what he wants. He or she is not, realizes that he or she cannot do something. And you might have forgotten, but mostly ask your parents when you're 2 or 3 and you really, I don't know, you cannot do. I'm thinking about today. My son had his first soccer practice, and just because he couldn't run as fast as the other kids to kick the ball, he would just sit down and pout and cry from the top of his lungs. So that's it, because you want what makes you happy and what makes you feel good, and you want it now. There are no no's, no rules, nothing. Again, very pleasure-seeking. Then the ego, right, is we begin to grow up, right, and interact with the world, and we begin realizing very early that we do not always get what we want, right, that there are ways that we can get what we want, but there's a certain how we need to approach this and when it is proper to find it. So from this, realizing that there is a world out there that has rules, that needs strategizing, this is where the ego grows in us, right? So now our mind has an id and an ego. Think about the ego as the part of your mind that deals with reality. It's you, right? You who is behaving in a certain way. And the ego needs to, it's basically the most difficult role, right? Because the ego is the messenger. He's the one who needs to negotiate all the time and needs to find out how to get what the id wants. Right? All of this is occurring in our mind, right? It's not that the ego is only us, right? But in a way, ego is the one that makes the final decision. But he or she is put in a very hard spot because, and think about it. I mean, how many times do you want to do something but you can't because there are rules? Your parents tell you no. Your teachers tell you no. Your school rules tell you no. The law tells you no, right? But the id is there all the time saying, but I want to do this because I need to do this. I deserve this, right? So the ego it begins to check in and figures out in the world that, okay, how do I please the id? It seems that I'm running into big problems all the time to please the id, and then this is when the superego also comes up, because in addition to the world being difficult, there are people that tell us many times when we're toddlers or small children that tell us the most dreaded, hated word for any child in the world, which is no. So I'm going to write it right here so you can remember that, right? So the ego tells us a big no. Superego tells us that we learn the word no. And who are these people? Who are these knowers? Well, of course, the first ones I'm guessing you come into mind, parents. Second that must come into mind, teachers or administrators. Religious figures tell us to, they tell us we cannot do this, cannot do that. Coaches, police officers, anyone whose authority you should abide by, right? You can't go there. You can't go out. No, it's not until 2 a.m. that you're going to be at that party. You're going to be back at 12. And it's no because I said so and I know what's best for you. All these no's that we're hearing all the time, build pretty quickly a strong superego, right? And this superego is by the book. It's the inner parent in us. It's the one that makes us feel terribly guilty when we do something we want and then that we shouldn't have, but it felt awesome. It's the guilt tripper, right? The buzz killer, whatever you want to call it. Although I don't know if that's appropriate to say. But he's also, the superego is the one that makes us feel like the good boy, the good girl, that we are supposed to be and that perhaps other people think we are. So going back to the ego, then again, the ego is all the time mediating between these two. So how do I please the id while keeping the superego also happy? Because if you understand what I've been explaining so far, you can understand that the superego can feel relentless. Anybody who has felt guilty, which means all of us, because I'm assuming none of us have a personality disorder that doesn't feel remorse. So guilt can be pretty relentless. And news for you guys, the older you get, the more relentless it becomes. I need to keep the rule enforcer, the superego, right? Everything he or she says, happy or content or at least satisfied. While I also want to please the id because the id wants to have fun all the time. All right. Why is this important? Well, it's important to know that this is a model of the mind, of the psyche, as Freud called it too, that he developed. And later on in the personality unit, we're going to see what happens when the ego just gives up, says, okay, you two have to really figure this one out, right? And this is when we apply defense mechanisms, when we deny reality, when we repress it, and this builds up in the unconscious. So that's something to keep in mind. You don't need to know anything about defense mechanisms at this point, just a very basic overview of this model of the mind that Freud developed. A final piece that is also important in Freud's theory is that personality is formed by the age of 6. So think about this. So depending on how you are and your experiences from 0 to 6 years old, what you have dealt with how you have dealt with these internal battles between your id and your superego, or better said or explained, how your ego has handled these conflicting, let's say, conflicting ways of operating between the id and the opposing interests between the id and the superego, how your ego has dealt with that as a mediator, then that is going to determine your personality traits for the rest of your life. Okay, so up until you're 5 or 6 years old, Freud says that you've become what you've become in terms of personality traits. When we talk about traits, we talk about permanent characteristics that change nothing or very little at the most throughout life. So, and one very little piece of data that is mentioned too in your book, but that I think has been asked in some tests here and there, is that he published a book on the interpretation of dreams. But if you know his methodology, of all the therapists, I don't remember another one that wrote, of the major psychologists, I don't remember any other that wrote about dreams. So, but that's important to know. I'm pretty sure that this book was published at the turn of the century. I also wanted to mention something else, and it is, I even make this mistake sometimes, so hopefully you'll be better than I am. And it's the difference between the term psychotherapist, right? And very different from psychoanalyst. Right? So psychotherapist is the same thing as a therapist, right? And one's therapist can take one or a mix or an eclectic approach to helping patients overcome issues or better adapt to certain situations, right? So a psychotherapist can take a psychoanalytical approach, or can also take a behaviorist approach. Something that is very common is for psychotherapists in the United States to take a very cognitive behavioral approach, right? So as I mentioned in class, and remember this very well, not all psychotherapists are psychoanalysts, but all psychoanalysts are psychotherapists. So said in another way, I hope I'm not confusing you, is that a psychoanalyst is a form of psychoanalysis is a form of psychotherapy. Okay, just to keep that in mind. To be very specific from now on when you mention this. Psychoanalysis reached its peak of popularity in the early 1900s, I believe, till the mid 1920s. Don't quote me on that. You might want to double check that, but with the rise of behaviorism, a school that we'll explain in a minute, psychoanalysis saw its decline. And part of it was that, Freud was very controversial, and when we study more of him, you'll see concepts that they weren't, let's say, digested very easily by public opinion. The emphasis he put on sex, I think, of course, logically so, wasn't taken very easily by other scientists, other psychologists, and the public in general, as I mentioned. Mostly, Freud has also been criticized by the scientific community because, we talk about interpretation of dreams, elements that represent this. How can we test, observe, or measure these elements? So two ways to associate this concept are, empiricism and psychoanalysis. Well, psychoanalysis or Freudian concepts lack empiricism, lack the ability to measure them, to observe them. And this was also something that led to its decline. Also, to go through psychoanalysis takes a long time. And we're going to talk about this later on, is much more about this. But in the Western world, represented by the U.S., there's the approach to treating abnormal behavior, is very. Let's just say this for the time being, is that it's a culture that doesn't like to wait very much. We want the quick fix, or something that is more, that progress is more palpable. Psychoanalysis requires, years of treatment. And it's, we're talking about building a relationship with a therapist that you feel comfortable in order to free associate or interpret your dreams without any taboos, as we said before. And it's a long, very long process. Something that within this medical approach that we have here in the United States of treating everything, with medication. When I say everything, it's an exaggeration, but having this tendency of treating most illnesses or abnormalities with a very medical approach and instantaneous approach to it. But in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, psychoanalysis is one of the dominant still schools of psychology, and we have several psychoanalytical offices here in New York City too that follow this school of thought in psychology as well. Okay, so now we're on to behaviorism. We're up to our fourth school of thought in psychology. So let's refresh for a minute the concept of psychology, right? It's a science of mental processes and behavior. Up until the mid-20s, psychology was only the science of mental life. There was a brief, mentioning of behavior with James in terms of what the physiology, with his theory of emotions. So there was a brief mentioning of it, but overall, up until that moment, it was mostly the science of mental life. So, because the main branches we've discussed so far, right, structuralism, psychoanalysis, have focused mostly on internal processes, right, images, feelings, sensations. It was a science that intended to unveil the mind's workings, or to explain them, or to basically, if you think about direction, it was all about looking inside the mind. There was little emphasis on behavior. But then, in the mid-20s, behaviorism takes a stand, right, and they stir the field. They rock the boat of psychology. They were huge on stating that in order for it to be a science, psychology needs to focus on phenomenon or events or anything that they wish to explore that has two main characteristics. Again, behaviorists are only going to study two things that have two main characteristics, right? And they are phenomena, events, or behavior that can be observable and measurable. Again, that can be observable or measurable. Whenever you hear these two terms, very likely we're talking about behaviorism. They're all about, what's out of the mind, right? As important to being a psychologist. We'll definitely talk more about behaviorists. There's a lot to say about them, but I want, for the purpose of this unit, I want you guys to focus on Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner, as your textbook did. I believe he mentions the three of them in that unit. Ivan Pavlov, he was a psychologist, but he was a physiologist. Yes, he was a physiologist. And however, we owe him the beginning of this revolutionary approach. It was very different from the schools that existed until the time. He was a Russian physician. Wait a minute. He was a physiologist or I'm pretty sure he was a physician who did research on studying digestion. That's right. And his subjects of study were dogs. Now, just as mentioning, you would not have liked to have been one of his subjects, because basically what Pavlov did was to, and I hope to not disgust you with this, but he would feed these dogs, and I believe cats too, and then he was interested in digestion, studying digestion, and then he extracted the food at different points in the digestive tracts, and which sometimes required surgical extraction. So gross, right? And so specifically, what you're interested in is that he had these dogs hooked up to these contraption, which required their salivary ducts, right? You see here. So they required their salivary ducts, right? I'm going to write this so you can under ducts to be duct to the outside, right? So the salivary, basically this was in order to measure and collect the saliva that was produced from these dogs too. So this is one study of his. And Pavlov would show them meal and measure and collect the saliva that they produce, gross. And but then by accident, he begins to realize that these dogs were messing up the experiment. He said, the experimenter, I'm guessing his research assistant, were enter the room, and without having a chance to see the food, the dogs would begin to salivate. So basically seeing the experimenter, without being shown the food, they would already have a natural reaction to something that they were not supposed to react to, right? Because you salivate when you see food that you like, that makes you hungry, but you don't salivate by watching a research assistant, So he called, Ivan Pavlov called this psychic secretion, right? So it was a secretion. It was these dogs were salivating for something that was in their minds, and then he also baptized this process with the term classical conditioning. This caught Pavlov's attention, and hence decided to check it out and to test it with another experiment, right? And it's the classical conditioning experiment. And I'll explain what this consisted of. And I'm sure you've heard this in other classes or in literature, this concept of Pavlovian conditioning. First of all, I need to clarify that actually no bells were used, and I thought when I was majoring in psychology, I also learned this way. But then later on, it turns out that he was actually using tuning forks, I guess. I don't know, to simplify the story. People say bells, doesn't matter, not very relevant. But let's continue using the bells to make it simpler. So Ivan Pavlov, in order to check this psychic secretion that when he saw the dog salivate to something that was not food, right, he would play these bells, right, and he would spray meat powder on the dog's tongues at the moment that he would start ringing the bell, and he would spray the meat powder on his tongues. Now, after several repetitions, and this is something that I want you to know and use from now on, the dogs learned, right? The dogs learned to associate the sound of the tuning fork or bell with the flavor of the meat powder. Now, when we talk in psychology, when we talk about learning, we talk about when we associate a stimulus with a response. Okay, so that's when I clarify this because we have this idea of learning as in learning in a class or learning through a course or through a teacher, right? So again, after several repetitions of him spraying the powder, ringing the bell at the same time, then these two stimuli became the same thing in this regard. So then the dogs began to respond to the tuning fork with the same way, or the bell, the same way they would react to the meat powder. So the dogs had been conditioned, classically conditioned to salivate when they heard the bell. And Pavlov coined this association, learned association, as classical conditioning. And classical conditioning, guys, is the genesis, the very beginning of behaviorism. The second figure that I want to talk about within this behaviorist school of psychology is John B. Watson. And John B. Watson is considered to be the founder of psychology. John B. Watson is best known, as I mentioned, for his famous or infamous Little Albert study. And Little Albert, this was an experiment in which John B. Watson trained a child, Little Albert was his name, or he was called like that, to be afraid of a white mouse using classical conditioning. So John B. Watson is who puts this concept more within the psychological concept, right? He was testing this classical conditioning concept that Pavlov had come up with. And basically, so again, he's making, in this study, making little Albert to be afraid of a white mouse using classical condition. So how does this study go? It's basically, he had the boy associate the white mouse with a loud bang. So at first, little Albert sees the white mouse and plays with it and doesn't have any fear of it, right? And then, again, through exposed repetition, just as Pavlov did with the dogs between the meat powder and the bells, right? So he did the same thing with little Albert. He would show the white mouse appear with a very loud, unpleasant bang, sound, right? That would cause him, that was not a pleasant sound. So after repeating it several times, then he would show, in the study, he would show the mouse to little Albert. Now remember, before this association, before this conditioning, little Albert was okay with the mouse. But then after the repetition exposure, along with this sound all the time, then when he started showing the mouse to little Albert without the sound, he would still begin to cry, and he would react in the same way as he did with the loud sound. Again, this experiment could never take place today because of the APA restrictions. But with this experiment or study, John B. Watson had achieved the application of conditioning by sort of having a child learn a phobia, right, and into what was believed to be an emotionally stable child. So he put, again, the classical conditioning concept coined by Pavlov, yet put into practice with human beings through John B. Watson. John B. Watson is also known for his 12 infants quotation, and this has to do with environment. Let me read this for you as it shows up on your screen. So, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and on my own specified world to bring them up, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train them to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. Now, I want you to think for a minute, how does this relate to behaviorism? And you can play pause and start to see if it's the same thing I'm going to explain right now. So hopefully you thought that yes. So no matter how this baby, or from what parents or genetic influences this baby is born with, it is his or her environment that will determine how he or she will end up to be. So this is a radical behaviorist concept that is important to know, because not only did John B. Watson define the very premise of behaviorism, but it illustrates the overall concept, which is environment is everything, and environment is going to turn you into who you become. So there are several takeaways here, right? What does the mind remind us of? What does this remind us? I ask you, what does this remind us of in terms of historical figures and the evolution of psychology and science, concepts, right? Hopefully empiricism, philosophers, hopefully Aristotle, right? We are born as a blank slate, and it is our experiences, what we capture from the environment through our senses, that it's going to determine who we are. There's not this idea of a mind being something intangible and something that lives on its own and that exists after death, after our physiological end of life, right? So we pick up any infant, and the environment will determine, or at least will be the main factor in who this baby becomes as an adult. Imagine, he went as far to say that the environment is going to determine between him being a lawyer or a criminal. Insert lawyer joke here. Just kidding. So this is a very controversial, because it was very different. It shaped psychology, and it turned its course into a very different one than the one we had been hearing that was more about the internal mind and its workings. So, and this also questions another thing that brings us this approach, with much discussion, I'd say, with a lot of controversy, is that, think about this, most of us want to believe that the way we turn all out, especially in the Western world, the way we turn out depends on our free will. But Watson is saying here, as a founder of behaviorism, that it is that our decision making or our mind has nothing to do with it, and we are basically the reflection of the environment in which we were raised. A very empiricist approach, a very nurture-based approach. You see how all these concepts are starting to all relate to one each other. So now we have the last behaviorist, one more to go, and that would be Mr. B.F. Skinner. He's actually considered one of the most prominent psychologists in the 20th century. He was a professor, and he also led his laboratories in Harvard University. As with all the others, we're going to talk about him in great detail. But for now, I want you to associate him with operant conditioning, okay? And operant conditioning is sort of a more sophisticated, it expands on Pavlov's classical conditioning. But with operant conditioning, the individual, right, you or the person conducting the behavior or the animal behavior is shaped by the environment too, but it's shaped by rewards and punishments. It's basically classical conditioning, considering too the factor that we shape our behavior based on the rewards or punishments we receive from our environment. By the way, B.F. Skinner worked mainly with animals, and he, in fact, I think it was, he did some very weird things with animals. Like, he trained some pigeons to play ping pong, and all of this based on the concept of rewards or punishments, how these affect our behavior and shape it. Let me try to explain this. So operant, and again, remember, you can pause this and, as you take your notes and digest these concepts in a more, patient way. When you do something, this is operant condition, when you do something that leads to the presence of a prize, a reward, reinforcement, as he called it, you'll likely engage in that behavior again. But if you're punished, then unlikely you will be engaged in that behavior again. I remember when my oldest daughter, I remember it vividly when she tasted chocolate for the first time on her first birthday, I believe. Yes, around the first birthday when she was 1 year old. And I remember the pleasure that she experienced from chocolate was just mesmerizing. She was mesmerized, completely enchanted by this taste she never had before. So very likely, she was going to engage in that behavior again, which I'm sure many of us can relate to, right? I like this, I'm going to, that would be positive reinforcement, right? And this is basically what you have to know up until now. Later in the learning unit, we'll learn more about negative reinforcement and negative punishment. But, so you can cross those out for now. So, and then punishment, as its name says and explains, is that, when we experience something that does not cause us pleasure, and we're very likely going to, engage in that behavior again. And because we don't want that punishment, correct? It's very simple, straightforward in that sense. So I remember my daughter too, my oldest daughter, when we took her to the doctor, and you know how pediatricians, they usually check for strep throat with a swab. That's the first screening, or one of the first screenings they want to do when you take a child to the pediatrician. And she just, from the first experience, you look at a swab, it looks very, what can that do? But then since she experienced it, as they put it in your throat, for her, it was the worst experience ever. And from then on, we would have to really, do magic basically for her to go through that again. She avoided that because she considered it a negative punishment for that to engage in that, so she wanted to avoid it. So again, this is to illustrate operant conditioning, which is basically we associate certain stimuli with a prize or a reward, and we're going to engage in those experiences that produce a reward, things we like to experience, and we're going to avoid behavior that is going to produce punishment, or going to through which we're going to experience punishment, something negative, a negative experience or an unpleasant experience. So if I were to ask you one thing, and it is, what's the difference between classical and operant conditioning? Yes, reinforcement and punishment, but to just pick your mind for a minute, I want you to think about this, and then you can also press pause if you wish to really come up with the idea on your own, which will help you remember it later. But ask yourself, in operant conditioning and in classical conditioning, how are they different in terms of who acts first in each? Again, I'm asking you to think about what's the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning in terms of environment and individual. So hopefully you thought about this, the fact that in classical conditioning, the environment acts first, right? You, the person, is just sitting in the park minding your own business, and the environment provides you with a stimuli to which you respond, right? And in operant conditioning, you operate the world around you. It is you. And depending on who you are, the one who's acting on the world, operating with the world, and depending on your operations, actions, or behaviors, the environment will reward or punish you. So overall, this is something also to think about. It could be a quiz question or a test question. Who knows, right? But overall, behaviorism is what knocks psychoanalysis out. This is not to say that one is more right than the other, but behaviorism plays an essential role in supporting psychology with, in its scientific status, and it has to be about measurable and observable data, and hence, this is what led to, basically what many argue led psychology to winning the scientific community over. Now, it won it to some extent, let's remember, because behaviorism did receive its criticism as well, as we'll explore with the next school of psychology, humanistic psychology. I believe it reached its peak point in the mid-50s, and humanistic psychology found that behaviorism was too deterministic, and that's a term I want you to learn, determinism. It's basically, is this philosophy or way of thinking in which determinism, I'm explaining, in which what is around you, your environment, is going to control who you are, who you become, how you act. And that's exactly what humanistic psychology criticized behaviorism for. So no matter if you're born in a violent environment, you'll end up being a violent person with a violent personality or violent tendencies. So the other concept I want you to think about when we think about humanistic psychology at its core is that human beings are positive. They had a very different, more positive outlook of society and of its people. Up until now, we had the psychoanalytical school that had a very dark and helpless approach or definition of human beings, right? And think about it. I don't think that we are comfortable saying that this unconscious ghost, is in charge of our building up, is in charge of our personality and will guide us through life and our relationships. And then you think about behaviorism, about this, basically us being the reflection, a sort of a chameleon of we take the color of our environment. It's very deterministic. So they had a more positive view. So I want you to think again about these humanistic psychologists are like the hippies of these schools. And they search for a more positive view on humanity. And their premise is basically, we are not animals. Humans have two distinct features, and this is two main things of humanistic psychology, or opportunities or factors that differentiate us from animals, right? This is what humanistic psychology says. we have unique experiences, right? We have unique experiences. So we're not animals. We have unique experiences that are the following. We have free will. Animals don't have free will, according to humanistic psychology, meaning that we can take control of our own fate. We can change our destiny. That's what free will is, and I'm sure you already know. And another unique experience. So again, I'm explaining the two unique experiences that humanistic psychology said, wait a minute, we are not that out of control of our life and our actions and behavior. One of them is free will, and the other one is potential for human growth, meaning that we can become the best that we can be. And this is a way to remember this is, I'm sure you've heard over and over again, teachers telling you on your reports, on your comments in class, that you you have all this potential, but that you haven't reached your potential in this class. And the reason for that, in part, is because it's sort of become a standard teacher comment or appreciation. It's because humanistic psychology had a huge influence in education. And just so that might help you remember. So again, these are the two unique experiences that, according to humanistic psychologists, say, no, we're not determined by our behavior and our fate, and our actions are not determined by the environment. That's way too radical in that sense. And, this idea of the unconscious sort of hijacking our mind and hence our behavior, we're not liking that much either. We're going to look for a more positive outlook on humanity and its capabilities of having a better life. With humanistic psychology, you need to remember two psychologists. When you hear humanistic psychology, you need to think about these two people immediately, are very representative of this school of thought in psychology. And these are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. I'll begin with Carl Rogers. His main contribution is he developed self-theory. And what did this self-theory consist of? Well, so listen carefully. So according to Carl Rogers, a humanist psychologist, would say we have a self-image and an ideal self. Again, I'll repeat that. We have a self-image and an ideal self. The self-image is how you see yourself. And your ideal self is who you would like to become, who you strive to become. Very simple. Carl Rogers says that our mental health, right, depends on the distance between your self-image and your ideal self. So basically, the longer the distance between how you see yourself and who you want to become or who you think you should become, then the less mental health you'll have. Inversely proportionate relationship. So there's sort of like a negative correlation. If you think that you are on the way of becoming that ideal person that you wanted and you've always strived to be, then your mental health is going to be okay. But if you see yourself never reaching that ideal self is either too, you have too much high expectations for yourself, or you've internalized these too much high expectations, impossible to reach, and then you don't see yourself, able. You feel yourself hopeless or overwhelmed by that expectation, unrealistic expectation. Then you're the greater your mental, the greater. How can I put this? In worse shape your mental health will be. And this distance between your real self and your ideal self is called incongruence. And again, the larger the incongruence, the larger the mental issues or mental. I hate to use the term issues. I'm just tired at this moment, but. Mental challenges. You won't be in a healthy state of mind, meaning that you might be depressed, or you might develop depression, or you might develop other conditions that require assistance. Now, if you see yourself, if your real self or your self-image is not there yet, right? But you find yourself on the path of becoming who you want to become, that best person, reaching your potential, then your mental health is going to be stable, is going to be a positive one. Abraham Maslow is also the other main humanistic psychologist, and also very well known in the education community. And when you think about Abraham Maslow, I want you to think about needs, and I want you to think about self-actualization, actualization. Self-actualization is something, it's a concept very similar to Rogers' ideal self. And it's that person you strive to be, and it's also part of our, Abraham Maslow says, this unique experience, free will especially, has the ability to lift us up if we make the right decisions and work for them. We all have the potential to lift ourselves up and become that ideal version of ourselves. So we can become that happy, great person with strong morals, altruistic, that helps people, that cares about relationship. And of course, this sounds easy, but and it may not be that difficult, but he explains it that in order to reach that self-actualization, he developed this theory, and perhaps you've heard about this before, which is this pyramid, the pyramid in which he explains these needs that need to be met in order for us to reach self-actualization, to reach this ideal state, right? So let me see if I can explain that again really quickly. So we strive to become this ideal person, right, to reach self-actualization. But what's preventing us from reaching that, or in order to reach that, we need to have some needs be met. Otherwise, it's impossible. So that's why I wanted you to think about needs and about this pyramid, the hierarchy of needs. So again, the hierarchy of needs, a theory proposed by Abraham Maslow, explains that in order to reach self-actualization, you see it at the very top of the pyramid, or in order to self-actualize, we need to walk up this pyramid, right? And each step explains a basic need, and we cannot step above this until these needs are met. So, for example, or an example that I read, I think in your book or somewhere else, is think about Katrina in New Orleans, right? That Category 5 hurricane. That hurricane left the population of New Orleans without the very basic needs, the physiological needs, the need for water, the need for food, the need for so these, I was going to say housing, but housing, having a roof, as we say in Venezuela, that would be part of the second. That's part of the safety needs, as you see in the pyramid. But because the very physiological basic needs weren't met, it became societal chaos. People were not being nice to each other. Looting began. So very far from self-actualizing. But if you think about it this way, if I'm hungry or if I'm dehydrated, there's no space in my cognitive capacity, in my mind, to search for being this ideal individual. So again, you need to have your physiological needs met in order for you to reach your safety needs, and then once those are met, then you think about your relationships and your needs for belonging. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid. And then, you see those love and belonging needs. He says that we have a need to establish friendships, romantic love, family acceptance, bonding, belonging to groups that provide us with a sense of purpose, with meaning. And then at the very highest level, once all those needs are met, then we can strive for self-actualization. We step into a different school, we're almost finished. And as you know, cognitive refers to thinking, to cogitate. I recently discovered that's a verb. To cogitate is to think. In cognitive psychology, it might be an easy way to remember, is the psychology of thinking, right? This way of exploring behavior and phenomena based on the way we think. So we could say that cognitive psychology brought mental processes back to psychology. I was trying to be there funny, but I guess I failed. But with a less of a radical approach in psychoanalysis or structuralism, they took things a little lighter and in more Lighter way, yeah. Um, you know, thinking might sound a little simplistic, but there are many cognitive processes. More, um, yeah. So think about. I'm just trying to look for an example. Cognitive psychology sees us as sees our behavior stemming from, originating in, or even, yeah, or caused by the way we think. And they see our mind as this computer, as a computer, basically. You have input, we have our input. There's a way that we input the knowledge we have, the way we process it, and then we output our knowledge and information in the way we think, right? And in all of these steps are what a computer does too, right? So think about how much of the time of the day we truly dedicate to trying to understand other people or trying to explain their behavior. And most part of our days we do spend thinking, right? Reflecting upon something that happens, and when we feel proud about something, or when we think about things other people did, or when we're predicting something that may happen, or when we're trying to strategize of, okay, well, I'm in this situation, what if I do this, what if I do that? We spend a great deal and great effort thinking and strategizing and interpreting information, and based on that interpretation, then other thoughts come into our mind, and this is what the cognitive approach is. Let's look at how this person is thinking and processing information. To give you another example, let's say somebody has a phobia of flying, and the cognitive approach would be, a psychoanalytical approach might be to go back to that time. Maybe you have a trauma or fixation. Maybe the plane represents something to you, or etc. But a cognitive approach would be, okay, let's look at statistics, and let's look at what the possibilities are of somebody crashing in a plane. And as you might know, they're very low. So, okay, so it's sort of these statistics, these facts might provide this person with an opportunity to think of things more with facts, instead of thinking, there's a high possibility of me crashing in this plane. So it's sort of approaching the way we think of things, how we interpret things. So my possibilities are not very high to die in this plane. They're actually very low. Again, that's changing the way you're processing, you're interpreting your trip on a plane for someone who has phobias flying. This is cognitive approach. This quote helped me understand what a cognitive approach to explaining behavior was. It's by Albert Ellis. He's a prominent cognitive theorist, and he developed cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very much in vogue here in the U.S. I'd say most therapists mainly take this approach. And Albert Ellis said that it's not what happens to us. I guess I'm missing something there. There's a typo. It's not what happens to you that shapes you into being or behaving in a particular way. Rather, it is how you think about what happens to you, what makes you feel or behave in a particular way. And I think this quote did it for me. And as you might see in that diagram, something happens to us, and we're going to behave according to how we think of that, how we interpret it, right? So think about this. And I'm sure you can, and think about it for a minute, so you can come up with a specific example. But two people have the same event occur to them. But then one of them bounces back and the other falls apart. The difference between the two is not the event itself, right? It's according to cognitive psychology, how they interpret it, which is going to then lead to what happens to both of them. So, and cognitive behavioral therapy consists a great deal of identifying how a patient sees these main events in their lives. The therapist just basically walks you through the process and tells you to say how you're thinking about this, how you're interpreting this, and works with you in trying to modify or strengthen, modify your thinking or strengthen rational thinking, right? And so, and also it's important to know that cognitive psychologists see our minds as an active problem solving system. So it's basically the way because we're always trying to solve something or trying to answer a question we have, and it's how basically we see or interpret the world that is going to determine our behavior. It's important to associate the names of Noam Chomsky, one of my favorite intellectual academics in the world. He's an MIT scholar, and in fact, he's a professor. He's a researcher at MIT. He works with language and development of language. And Jean Piaget, we're going to hear a lot about him in developmental psychology, and he developed a theory of development in which he says that from birth to, we go through these different stages based on the way we think and we operate with the world and how we interpret it. And then finally, the last portion of this cognitive approach is the existence of the field of cognitive neuroscience, and a field that combines neuroscience with psychology to diagnose and treat any possible disorder. And it is think about this. Thanks to cognitive neuroscience, it's easy to know whether we're thinking about either academics, a sad event, or a former boyfriend or girlfriend, or we're thinking about future, or we're thinking about math. Basically today, thanks to cognitive science, there's a way to explore what area, with brain imaging techniques, people can know, we can know, identifying what areas of the brain are active during a specific time, and this is what cognitive neuroscience do. It studies what areas of the brain are active when you think about this and that, and this subfield of cognitive psychology is important, something that we'll be exploring throughout the year. Biopsychology. It's basically the biological approach or the physiological approach to explain behavior and mental processes. And this one is very simple to understand. There'll be an entire unit dedicated to it. That won't be that easy, but I'm sure you can do it. And with biopsychology, the behavior is a consequence of our genetics and our physiology. Genetics and physiology, that's it. So everything, our feelings, thoughts, and behavior result from physiology and DNA. So basically, everything that is psychological has a physiological root. If someone has depression, then it's due to a chemical imbalance. And we see many commercials on this with antidepressants. And if someone has trouble sleeping, this is not about trauma. This is not, or it has little to do with trauma, or it's basically, there's something physiologically that is impeding that sleep. Let's say if someone's an alcoholic, then the first thing that a biopsychologist will look at is family history. So it's a very medical approach to psychology. And this is also a tendency, in addition to cognitive neuroscience, which is part of the cognitive approach, that is a strong tendency within psychology, I guess, in that insistence in trying to emerge as a formal science. So things we have to think about with the biological approach is, when we talk about physiology, we talk about our body, right? And physiology refers to the nervous and the endocrine systems that are in our body. Its main base is the main base of the nervous system, which is the brain. The brain's chemistry depends on how neurotransmitters or nerve cells are communicating with each other. It's a very complex circuitry that we're going to, again, explore in the biological psychology unit. And as I mentioned, this is the map, basically, when we talk about biological psychology. So I was explaining in the previous slide that when we talk about biopsychology, we talk about physiology, and physiology involves our body, our nervous system, and our endocrine system, and when we talk about the endocrine system, we're talking about hormones, how hormones are working. So, of course, now then that's where we enter territory in which there's a significant difference between the hormonal functioning between males and females, regardless of their age. Violence, for instance, a biological psychologist might look at what were the presence of testosterone, which is much higher in males. Yes, I say much higher as we'll discover in that chapter that females also have levels of testosterone much lower than in males. And testosterone is something associated with violence and aggression. So perhaps aggressive, violent behavior, a biopsychologist will look at the levels of testosterone at that particular moment in that individual. They will also look at the age of that individual. Testosterone, the peaks of testosterone in males is during teenage and young adulthood. So obviously, if the person is young or is a teenager, they're going to have more aggressive tendencies or present more aggressive behavior, display it more than a male in their 50s. So this is the type of approach that, again, a biopsychologist or a psychologist with a biological approach will take in explaining behavior. And then, they're also going to be looking, as I mentioned previously, looking at family history, the brain functions, whether it might be a chemical chemical balance, or a short circuitry, right, of the brain, and hormone levels. We'll talk about that too more in class. One last thing too, a biopsychologist will immediately, let's say in explaining behavior, perhaps they might hypothesize too, in addition to levels of particular hormones or brain, they might look at whether there is a chemical influence, use of particular drugs. For instance, cocaine is a potent stimulant that could lead to aggressive behavior or at least offensive behavior. So they might look at whether there are influence, or alcohol. Alcohol is also highly associated with violent and aggressive behavior. So they might look whether the patient was consuming alcohol or was in withdrawal of alcohol. Again, this is sort of explaining that they're going to look at possible chemical influences that are not natural, that are not produced within our body, but instead caused by a substance such as alcohol or drugs. The final contemporary approach to studying behavior and mental processes is from a social cultural approach. All of us throughout cultures are similar and different, and this is what interests psychologists and researchers in this field. Think about it. Think about how much about how we behave and how we think and how we feel is influenced, to what extent, by where and among who we are right now. Right? Someone's behavior in a particular social cultural context can be considered abnormal, yet in other societies not. In fact, the same person in the same time era exhibiting the same behavior will be interpreted in different ways by others around him or her, depending on where they're located. I'll give you an example as to how a psychologist from a social cultural point of view might explain or explore behavior. So let's say I begin out my day and I'm, living in Brooklyn as I do, and I'm looking around afraid all the time with a heightened sense of apprehensiveness, and I don't want to walk around a street before really observing who's around me. Now, of course, there are plenty of Brooklyn jokes about safety and everything, and yes, Brooklyn can be in certain areas dangerous, but to be all day long thinking about my surroundings, it could be interpreted as being paranoid, right? Which is a symptom of several mental conditions. But this same behavior by me, if I lived in Baghdad in Iraq, that same behavior, same circumstances, would actually be adaptive because of the culture and because of the societal events that are occurring at the same time. So again, this is what a social cultural psychologist will from more of a social in the example I gave you, will this is how he or she will observe this. Like, the same behavior, same individual, but in different societies, different contexts, might be interpreted as abnormal or normal, in fact, adaptive. Also, from a social cultural point of view, we cannot ignore groups. Groups are an important entity from this standpoint. Think about the behaviors you express or exhibit when you are with your friends, as opposed to when you're with your, let's say, even different groups of friends. For those of you who have friends outside of poly, and when you're among them, there are certain characteristics of yourself, certain behaviors, things you will say, things you will do that perhaps you wouldn't do among your only poly friends. So, or you wouldn't behave in the same way as you would in a family reunion, or with your parents, or with only your siblings. When you are in poly prep versus as when you are with your outside of school baseball or soccer team. Think about think about behavior when, and I'm very familiar with this, as to when you are in fact among friends of yours that are of one gender. Let's say you're a male and you're among your male friends. You're going to think, you're going to express yourself differently. You're going to say different things as if you were the only male in a female group, and vice versa. So this is how, again, a social cultural approach would do to examine behavior. Because society, is formed by, or these are certain factors that, from a more social than cultural standpoint, still has cultural elements in it. A psychologist from this standpoint would view, again, behavior and mental processes. What is a leadership taking place? Are you a leader, or you're being followed? You're following a leader. What is a group you're in? Your friends, your teachers, your socioeconomic status. So that also involves groups. Very important from a social psychology point of view is the media. How the media indoctrines and also models certain behaviors. You will be surprised when we study this more in detail in the social psychology unit. But saving the best for last, within this social cultural approach, now more culture than social, although you could argue that one comes with another. But when we talk about cultures, one sort of a main division that we need to talk about is the difference between cultures that are individualistic versus cultures that are more collectivist. There's a continuum. There's not this radical stance on whether one society falls in another. However, United States and most Western countries are significantly individualistic. In fact, I believe that the United States and Great Britain are, let's say, if there were, in this continuum, the U.S. and the Great Britain are cultures that are considered the most individualistic. And on the other side of the continuum, on the collectivist side, Asian and Middle Eastern countries are considered to be highly collectivist. And this dichotomy is sort of at the center of what can explain much of our behavior from this standpoint. Because, you see, what a society values is ultimately, much of that is going to reflect what we value. And based on that, on these values, whether they're values that are more highlighted in a collectivist society or highlighted different in a collectivist society than from an individualist society, is going to drive most of our behaviors. To give you an example, Latin American societies are a hybrid, but are considered more on the collectivist side. So, I think about, I'll give you an example of a particular behavior. Let's imagine somebody who is 30 or in his or her mid-30s and still living with her parents. Here in Venezuela,
Latin America, right, where I come from, not that it goes unnoticed or championed, you're like, yay, you're still 30 and living with your parents, but it is viewed in a much neutral sense. People don't make a big deal of it, nor is it viewed even negatively, I'd say. You know, the question, if that person has, you know, the question is, in that case, has he or she married or not? If he or she has not married, then yeah, that's a natural thing to do, to live with your parents. So in fact, it's pretty much appreciated. I remember my grandmother, how much she would say, oh, you know, I wished at least one of my 8 daughters and sons would have stayed at least one with me. That's sort of an expectation in the past that existed throughout Latin America. New Year's Eve, a holiday, right? What do people do people throughout the world, you know, celebrate and welcome the New Year's, but here in the U.S., it's more of a day. It's sort of a day which you go out with your friends, right, and or your romantic partner. In Venezuela, until you marry, until you have the family of your own, it's very important to spend New Year's Eve with your family. And again, we can see here how a more collectivist society can shape behavior differently than in an individualist society, right? Because in American society, where more individualistic values are highlighted or emphasized, here in the U.S., we value, well, I say we, I kind of feel uncomfortable saying we, but in the U.S., independence is valued. Keeping the family together in important events, although seen as important, might not occupy, and this is based on studies done, because you might say, well, I view it differently, but independence is valued over family. Like if you need to sacrifice being with your family to be independent, well, that's more important. And that's going to guide many actions, many behaviors. The simple act of going to college, going away from your family at such a young age, someone in Venezuela or Latin America might say, is frowned upon, is sort of seen strange, and maybe that child doesn't love their parents and grandparents as much, and whereas here it's seen as good for you that you're going to be independent, you're going to be on your own, living, searching for that individual future, depending less on your parents. So I don't mean to take any stance here. I don't have an agenda, as I told you guys with politics in class, but both collectivist and individual cultures have their pros and cons. Whether one is right and wrong depends on how it fits us and how we think of it. But the important part is always and this has a lot to do with a cross-cultural approach to explaining behavior, which goes within this social cultural perspective. So, to give you another example, in individualistic cultures like the U.S., Great Britain, people are very prone to loneliness, right? Especially the elderly. In more collectivist societies, elders are viewed as being, as having sort of this godlike wisdom and authority. I think about the grandmother figure in Latin American societies, which is the one I'm most familiar with, in which whatever the grandmother says, you don't question it at all. That's seen as, so individualistic cultures are, I've given you 2 examples in which it's seen as negative. Well, perhaps not. In more collectivist societies, people spend more time invested in avoiding rejection. Right? Impression management is very important. And then that gets tied into class. And then, so you need to impress people by making them know or believe that you're from a higher class, socioeconomic class than others. And that becomes problematic too, because what others think of you is more important than being yourself. And we can say that in individualistic societies like the U.S. or Great Britain, at the other end of the continuum, being yourself, it perhaps has become much more important than what others think of you. So that's just to give you a fair example as to how these can go both ways. There was a study in which countries were ranked based on indicators that would give them a score on if they got, I think it was a total of 100 points. And if countries that scored high, like you see in the screen, like the U.S. is in first place, that would be considered the most individualistic based on this study. And you have Guatemala in the last place with 6 points. That would be considered more on the collectivist side. So you can check any countries. I mean, think about, I'm sure you're curious, but hopefully if you haven't thought about this, your heritage, where did your grandparents come from? And see whether that can explain how perhaps your family, particularly, tends to be more on the collectivist side than on the individualistic side, and so forth.